All right, I'm going to try to make this as easy and as smooth as possible on little sleep and early in the morning while I'm sipping on my Black Rifle Coffee Company morning stimulus. What I'd like to talk about is the fact that we have boatloads of systematic errors, vulnerabilities, incompetence, idiocy, and outright complicity with our enemies in our own government. Now, some may say that that's conspiratorial. That that's simply being dramatic. That's hyperbolic. It's not politically correct. Well, I tell you what, you're free to think that. But when you get your asses handed to you, because you're in dreamland instead of reality, it won't be a matter of you accusing others and slandering others and using your positions to mitigate others and cover up your incompetence and foolishness. No, it will be your asses being handed to you for being in those positions when these things occur. You will be held responsible. Perhaps what some of you don't quite comprehend inside the Beltway and outside of it is your predicament. Do you not understand what I mean when I warn you, if you go the way of Babylon, you will pay the consequences of Babylon? What I mean by that is if you go the way of pushing the very things that enrich you but rot the country, morally, ethically, and otherwise, what will happen is you will pay the consequences, and it will be exponential. What we have here in the predicament that we are in is quite simply a failure of people to deal with themselves as they are, and a failure of people to stand up against it and call them out on it. You know, I don't know when Capitol Hill became Mount Emasculation, but I'm here to tell you that's the way of Babylon. Now, I've watched this mess go on for over 50 years in our entire country. Now, I can't coexist when there's nowhere else for me to go after being pushed away and out and mitigated for most of my life. All right, so now I've turned and I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight some of you if you don't get out of the way. It doesn't take a building with a $500 billion budget to figure out the problems that are going on in this country. What it takes is the balls, the intestinal fortitude to call it what it is. That being the case, you are in a situation where if you do not change your course, you will preside over the greatest defeat in human history and the greatest waste of opportunity any nation state has ever had. And it will be just in happening to you. You know, being a steward of the country, being a leader of the country, being tasked with doing what is best for the entire country has very little to do with your reputations, your career paths, right? And it has everything to do with character, with capabilities, with talent, skills, and the presence of heart and mind to be a servant leader. The reason why I bring this up so often is because I am constantly being asked, how can we fix this? And I'm constantly being told at every level in your security apparatus how absolutely wormwooded and screwed up it is. Now you should ask yourselves, while you're patting yourselves on your backs, why that is. You know, it's also amazing to me that people don't have the time or don't take the time to read the things that I put out and people like me put out, diagnosing the problems so that we can focus on proper solutions. And what that tells me is some of you are in your wrong positions. You are in the wrong roles in leadership at the wrong time. And that will have a bearing on the level of consequences and complexity that we have to deal with in order to course correct. Again, we did not arrive here overnight. We arrived here because of complacency, complicity, incompetency, pride, avarice, and hubris over many decades. Now that it has been institutionalized and normalized into our system, if you want to fix this system, you're going to have to accept responsibility for having allowed it to get to this point, or it will be taken from you and it will be replaced with something that functions properly and does the job that it's supposed to do for the benefit of the entirety of the nation. Now, if that wrinkles some of your starched shirts, well, I really don't care. You see, your world focuses on the externals. Mine focuses on the internals outward. And some of you could put on 50 layers of clothes and you'd still be butt-ass naked because of how stripped you already are and transparent to a lot of us, and your idiocy and your foolishness and your pride, your avarice and your hubris, your greed and your fakery. You have plundered the American people long enough. You're entering into a period of time where your consequences will scale exponentially. That means the penalties for holding on to your pride will likewise scale exponentially in severity. Some of you need to take a little time to meditate on what that means. Nothing here happens in a vacuum. You've heard me say that over and over and over. Everything has a ripple effect, a cascade effect. And it is on those things, your aggregated effect, that you will be judged. Now, some of you are saying, well, judge not lest you want to be judged. Don't start that crap with me. If you're going to use scripture out of context, I will beat the hell out of you with it in the right context. All right? Don't put me in that position. Let me tell you what you pay for in Washington, D.C. Talk. White papers, not action. You uphold a broken, paralysis-driven, rotting corpse of a bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy has deep impacts upon those that try to work in it, work with it, and it's supposed to work for. My question to you is, are you going to be a part of the solution in fixing this, or are you going to remain part of the problem? You must understand, the great majority of the people in this country, right, your citizenry, as well as the bulk of the people in the national security arena and the civilian side, don't believe in you anymore. They don't trust you, they don't like you, and they know what I'm saying is true. Part of being leaders is taking the risk to do what must be done, to say what must be said. What I see is the shadow of leadership. I see counterfeits of leadership. I see facsimiles of leadership. It sounds good, it looks good, it's not good. The fruit is on that tree. And that's something you can't hide. Now, there's probably going to be a stampede of people out of my network, all right? And if that's the case, so be it. You don't need to be connected to me anyway, because you're part of the problem. And by leaving it, you'll just prove it that much more. But those of you that actually want to change things, stop giving in to fear. Stop giving ground to incompetence, to foolishness, to lies, to codependency, and to political correctness. There's a time for diplomacy, and then there's a time for punitive action. It's time for you to start taking some action and stand up for what you say you believe, or else you are ceding it to the shadow of the real. You know, being in leadership is not a popularity contest. Contrary to popular belief, it's a servant role. And if you don't have a servant's heart, you should probably get the hell out of leadership, whether you're in the public or private sector, because we're coming to expose and strip you like a cheap French whore. This badness has gone on long enough. Now, if you're offended by that, well, go take a Valium and have a nice shot of whiskey and go play golf. Because you're in the wrong role. And if you're offended because of whatever sex equipment you have down below, you're in the wrong role. This isn't about you. It isn't about what you do in the bedroom. That is irrelevant. But it shows me a lot what you focus on, and it reveals a lot that you focus on certain things that do not accomplish anything that moves the dial forward to help the American people. Because it's all about you. And because it's all about you, that's why we're in the spot we're in. So if you're not willing to change that, you need to pack up your office and you need to resign, or we're going to fire your asses and we're going to remove you. And you can scream all day long that you're a victim. Yes, you are. You're a victim of your own self-deception and your own delusion and your own lack of character and a willingness to take responsibility. Do you understand? Do not underestimate what you are now creating and have created that is a unified front against you that you can't see. Do not underestimate what you have gotten yourself into with your enemies outside of this country. Because they know every single thing you're going to do before you do it, because you're that obvious. Now, if you were decent leaders, you would have anticipated that. In fact, if you had been leaders with vision, we would never have arrived at this place in our history as a country. Yet again, the fruit is on the tree, and it is a bitter fruit indeed. So those of you that get pissed off and offended because I say this, you're part of the problem. And I don't care what it is your gender is. That's irrelevant to me. But I can tell you what, your goddamn goddess culture shit is gonna go. Or we'll stand back and let your enemies eat you alive. Do you not comprehend that? And then we will turn around and defeat your enemies after you're out of the way, because you are working against your own best interests. And you will be humbled and raised up, or humiliated and torn down from your positions. That is your predicament. So I'm going to circle back around and talk about King David. Do you know why it is I often say that King David couldn't rule America the way it is? It's because you like your counterfeits. It's because you're not awake. You may be woke, but you're not awake. Well, that said, you're also desolate. You're blind, and you devour your own. So how does that play into King David? Well, let's circle back around as well to when King David was still a shepherd boy, and he showed up at the battle lines, seeing the armies of Israel retreat. And there is Goliath mocking them and demanding that the king, in this case being King Saul, come out and fight him one-on-one. Now, where was the king? He surely wasn't at the front. No, King Saul was in his tent at the back. He never left his tent in the camp. He was afraid. Just like the armies he was to be commanding and leading was afraid. They were afraid, which is why they were retreating and running in terror from Goliath. This incensed David. It infuriated him. Where's the leadership? Why is it that the armies of Israel, God's people, are running from the battlefield from this uncircumcised Philistine? It was because they were in fear. False evidence appearing real. It was because their king was in fear. False evidence appearing real. It was because they were judging the situation. Their sit rep was based solely upon external appearances. They were trusting in their own wisdom and their own works, apart from the God of Israel. They had no faith. So while the armies of Israel were retreating, David was running towards Goliath to size him up. Now note, no one believed in David. His brothers didn't believe in him. In fact, his eldest brother condemned him, judged his heart. This as his elder brother was with those running away from Goliath, back towards their king, King Saul, who was still sitting in camp in his tent. That's not leadership, now is it? So, King David was still crown prince at the time. He had been crowned, but he showed respect to the king on the throne, King Saul, as he should have, because he trusted in the Lord's timing. You see, David's strength wasn't in basing his perceptions on outward appearances, but in the truth of what God said. David's fortress wasn't in the camp, it was in God. David's faith was in God, not his own wisdom and works. So when David was given the green light by King Saul to go confront Goliath, David didn't do it in the way that King Saul would have done it had he had the courage to confront Goliath himself. Oh no. David couldn't even use King Saul's armor and weapons. And he respectfully took off the armor and handed back the armor and the weapons, because he couldn't go fight Goliath with armor and weapons that he had not tested. Remember why it is I always say test your signals? Test your signals intelligence. Test all things. Yet when David went to go fight Goliath, he ran towards Goliath and the entirety of the armies of the Philistines. That's courage. That's trust in the strength of the Lord. And that is trusting that God Almighty was his fortress and would give him the victory. Now contrast that with when David arrived at the beginning of the story at the battlefield, and everyone's running away from Goliath towards King Saul. Here is David proving who he trusted, who he was. He knew who he was in the Lord. He knew his identity. He was confident in believing that God would give him the strength, be his fortress and his shield, and give him the victory. And God used David as an example of what his kind of leadership looks like. It's servant leadership, and it leads from the front. It leads in faith, and it takes risk. Quite a contrast to leadership in our day, far too often, wouldn't you say? See, there's nothing new under the sun. Our times are not so different. Most leaders rely on their own wisdom and their own understanding and their own works, apart from God, and they trust only in what they see and comprehend with their own five senses and their own mind apart from it. So the means and methods that they use when faced with a challenge fail. That's why you never should follow leaders ruled by fear and confusion. They're not leaders. They're ruled by false evidence appearing real. They don't have courage. They're not strong, they're actually weak, regardless of how they may appear. That's how you lose wars. That's how your nation becomes a wreck. That's how policies are enacted that create more problems than they solve. And that is how you lose respect of your people you are to lead. And a culture that develops around such a leader mimics that leader. You understand what I'm telling you? Leadership is not about you. Leadership is about who, in whom, and in what you put your faith, your trust, and how that plays out in your choices. You know, it's amazing. I hear all the time how important it is for people to have data, more data. If we only had more data, right? I've even fallen into that trap at times. Right? You could fall into analysis paralysis very easily. But there's a point at which you hide behind what you think you need because you don't have the courage to actually take the risk to follow your gut and actually take action. That's one of the major entropic effects that occurs within bureaucracy. It's endemic. It's corrosive. And it does not lead to good outcomes. Sometimes you have to take initiative. You have to adapt. And you have to take risk. Now, here's another thing I want to bring up about David in our times. The people I find that I irritate the most, or they write me off, like David's elder brother, they judge me wrongly. And like Saul, are locked in fear and confusion. And they're ruled by their pride and incompetence. They're insecure. And they do not believe that God would use anybody to do anything because they don't believe that God would use them. Because that means that they would have to let go of their pride. They would have to let go of their wisdom and the way that they do things, which is locked in that pride. And humble themselves to even have the smallest inkling of the possibility of faith that God would use them. So, if God can't use them, they project that on others. God surely can't do that with anybody else. And God wouldn't. That's their perspective. And they project that on everybody else because they are relying upon their own wisdom and works. Now, how's that working for them? Well, what are the outcomes of that paradigm? Fear, false evidence appearing real, they're in a lie, and confusion. Both are synonymous with being in a lie. And all of those are synonymous with being in pride. There's a reason why we say that if you have but the faith of a mustard seed, you could tell this mountain to go throw itself into the sea and it would be done. Now consider that. Consider what I'm telling you. Mustard seed is about as small a seed as you'll ever find. Now that tells you how little faith that those that don't believe in others, that think, that God might be able to use them to do something, right? How little faith those that are projecting onto other people that God would surely never do that really have. They're exposed. They are stripped naked in the light, and they have no faith. Worse yet, they project their lack of faith onto others because of their pride, because they're unwilling to admit that is the case. Now that is a problem. Are those the kind of leaders that you want leading you into battle? Are those the kind of leaders you want trying to solve the problems of your country? What is this country ruled by? Fear and confusion. False evidence appearing real, and confusion, which means it's being ruled by lies. You can tell by how people are living their lives and what they're turning to, what they lean upon in times of crisis. Most lean upon their own understanding, meaning their own wisdom, their own works, and external appearances. They never see past that level. That makes them highly susceptible highly vulnerable to being deceived, not only by their own thoughts and their own choices, but by external forces. So they're blind even to the realities of what is going on in the observable and the external world in which they base all of their perceptions. So if you're easily deceived, ask yourselves, is that the kind of leadership you want in a war? Because you are in a war, and in a war there are but three kinds of people: soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. And all war is deception. Now think about that. How often do you hear China brought up in terms of avoiding war, right? You hear that a lot with the elite. You know, well, we've got to avoid war. Is there any way that we can avoid war with China? No, you can't, because you're already in one, you damn imbecile. You can't avoid something that is already ongoing and occurring. You can deny it, but that does not change the fact that you are still in a war. Just that you're not willing to fight it. You're in denial of it. And usually those that are in denial of it have some sort of reason why they deny it. And it's not just fear, it's complicity, meaning that they get something from it. In this case, many make a lot of money playing that card. But that card is a joker card. It makes a fool out of you. And it also exposes you for what you actually trust in. You see, you can deny that you're in the war that you're in all day long. But the fact of the matter is, it does not change the fact that somebody is waging war against you. So the next question is, what do you gain from being in denial of that war? Or what have you gained in the time leading up to the point where it became apparent to more and more people that war is being waged against us? You know, if you're complicit with the enemy in a war, that means you're a traitor. That means you're also part of the problem. That means you are an enemy. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Because no one has a vested interest in denying the reality that they're in unless they're getting something from it, some sort of benefit. Now, isn't that right? So what are you getting as a benefit for denying the fact that your enemies are waging a war against you that you are in denial of? Huh? A false sense of peace and security? Greater profit margins? You see, you can hide all day long. You can hide all day long and pretend that no one sees it. But your actions right, will expose you. That's what it means, right? When we say, your sins will surely find you out. In the end, you will always be exposed. Denial is futility whitewashed. So, again, I ask you, when you look around this nation and you look around the nations on earth, what rules them? Fear and confusion. And where is it coming from? Well, their leadership, of course. Their elite. All of that reminds me of Psalm 2. Why are the nations in a tumult, like the tossing of the sea? Why do the leaders imagine a vain thing and set themselves up saying, we will break the bonds? Right? We will free ourselves. Well, free yourselves from what? What are they freeing themselves from? Because it looks to me, in our time, if you apply that psalm, that they're not freeing themselves, they're enslaving you because they're enslaved to a lie, their pride, their avarice, and their hubris. That is something you need to consider. You need to consider how that plays out. You need to consider how that affects everyone. And they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't have something to gain by attempting and doing it. It's the same reason why they deny that we're in a war. They're afraid of the consequences, or they don't know how to get out of the consequences that their choices, their policies, and their actions have led the nation to. They are terrified of being exposed and losing credibility, which means they lose wealth, power, and influence. So they shepherd you with lies. They shepherd you with confusion. And they lead you to your own destruction. You become their sacrifice on the altar of their own egos. Do you understand what I'm telling you? And even still, after doing that, entire nations of people have been sacrificed on the altar of their leaders' egos. And it still did not stop the fall of those societies and those leaders from paying the consequences of their pride. Pride always comes before the fall. You can deny that too, all you want. It will only hasten your fall. So I want you to consider these things in light of history, in light of what I've brought up specifically, and in light of your present predicament. And ask yourself why you have the leaders that you do. Because in this country, what you have is you have leaders that you choose. What does that say about you? Because in this country, it's not just the leaders, it's those who put them there that hold the responsibility for what they do while they're in a position of authority and power. Do you understand? There's a reason why it is I constantly am showing you and telling you, as it is for people, so too it is for nations.
So many Kishelan, yeah, my soul.